Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're going to spend some time with one of medieval society's most overlooked workers. Not a knight, not a noble, not even a particularly respected craftsperson. Tonight, we're talking about laundresses. The women who spent their entire lives in a never-ending battle against dirt, stains, and the simple fact that medieval people wore clothes. Before we begin, if you enjoy this kind of content, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely want to. No pressure. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's always nice to know who's joining us tonight. Now, get comfortable. Maybe adjust your pillow, pull up your blanket, and let's ease into the world of medieval laundry. A world where cleaning a single shirt could take an entire afternoon, and where the smell of lye soap was just part of the landscape. Let's start with a simple truth. Being a laundress in medieval times was not a desirable occupation. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't well paid, and it certainly wasn't easy. In fact, if you could avoid becoming a laundress, you absolutely did. The work was physically demanding to the point of being punishing. It required access to water, which meant either living near a river or hauling buckets from a well. It required strength, because wet laundry is remarkably heavy. And it required patience, because medieval laundry was not something you could rush through on a Sunday afternoon. Most laundresses were women, though occasionally you'd find men doing the work in monasteries or large households. These women were typically at the lower end of the social scale. Many were widows who needed income. Some were unmarried women with few other options. Others were simply born into families where this was the trade, and so they learned it from their mothers and grandmothers before them. The pay was modest at best. In England during the 14th century, a laundress might earn about 2 pence per day, assuming she could find regular work. To put that in perspective, a skilled carpenter could earn 4 to 6 pence per day. A simple loaf of bread cost about a halfpenny. So a laundress was earning enough to survive, but not much beyond that. And the work was constant. Because here's the thing about medieval life that we often forget. People still got dirty. They still sweated. They still spilled things on their clothes. They still needed clean linens for their beds and clean cloths for their tables. Someone had to wash all of that, and that someone was usually a laundress. But unlike our modern washing machines that can clean a load of laundry in 30 minutes, medieval laundry was an all-day affair. Sometimes a multi-day affair. Let me explain why. Before you can wash anything, you need water. Lots of water. And in medieval times, getting water was not as simple as turning on a tap. If you were fortunate, you lived near a river or stream. This was actually where most professional laundresses preferred to work. Rivers provided an endless supply of water, and the current could help with rinsing. Many medieval towns and villages had specific spots along the riverbank designated as laundry areas. You'd see groups of women gathered there, kneeling on the bank or standing in the shallows, pounding clothes against rocks. But river laundry came with its own challenges. In winter, the water was numbingly cold. Your hands would turn red and then white, and you'd lose feeling in your fingers. But you couldn't stop because you needed the income. In summer, the river might be crowded with other laundresses, all competing for the best spots. And year-round, you had to contend with the fact that the same river you were using to clean clothes was also being used upstream for waste disposal, watering animals, and various other purposes that we won't dwell on too much. If you didn't live near a river, then you needed a well, and wells presented their own difficulties. First, you had to draw the water, bucket by bucket. A single bucket held perhaps 2 or 3 gallons of water. To wash a load of laundry, you might need 20 or 30 gallons, sometimes more. That's a lot of trips to the well. Then you had to carry those heavy buckets back to wherever you were doing the washing. Water is heavy, approximately 8 pounds per gallon, so each full bucket weighed 20-something pounds. And you'd be making multiple trips, carrying this weight, day after day. It's no wonder that laundresses often developed strong arms and persistent back problems. Some wealthier households had their own wells in their courtyards, which made things somewhat easier for their servants. But most laundresses worked for multiple clients and had to transport the water themselves. And here's something else to consider. In many medieval towns, water from wells wasn't free. Some wells were communally owned and required payment. Others were privately owned and definitely required payment. so the laundress had to factor in the cost of water when calculating whether a job was even worth taking. Once you had your water, you needed to heat it, because cold water alone wasn't going to remove most stains or kill vermin. And heating water in medieval times meant fire, which meant wood or charcoal, which meant more cost and more labour. You'd fill a large cauldron or pot and set it over a fire. Then you'd wait. And wait. Because heating 30 gallons of water over an open fire takes time. Quite a lot of time. While you waited, you might prepare the soap or soak the most heavily soiled items in cold water. But mostly, you just waited for the water to heat. All of this, and we haven't even started washing yet. Medieval people did have soap, though it wasn't quite like the soap we use today. And depending on when and where you were in the medieval period, soap might not have been readily available or affordable for everyone. The most common cleaning agent was lye. Lye is a strong alkaline solution made from wood ash. It's harsh, effective, and completely capable of burning your skin if you're not careful. But it was cheap and relatively easy to make, which is why laundresses relied on it so heavily. To make lye, you'd collect wood ash from your fireplace or hearth. This ash would be placed in a wooden barrel or large pot with holes in the bottom. Then you'd pour water through the ash, slowly, and collect the liquid that dripped out. This liquid was your lye. The colour ranged from pale yellow to brownish, depending on the type of wood that had been burned. The strength of the lye varied. Too weak, and it wouldn't clean effectively. Too strong, and it would damage the fabric and your hands. Experienced laundresses knew how to judge the strength by the feel of the liquid between their fingers, though this method wasn't particularly scientific and occasionally resulted in ruined linens or painful chemical burns. Soap, when it was available, was made from animal fat combined with lye. This created a substance that was somewhat better for fabrics than pure lye, though not by a huge margin. Soap was brownish or greyish, soft or semi-liquid in consistency, and had an unpleasant smell. This wasn't the fragranced, colourful soap bars we're familiar with. This was functional soap designed purely to remove dirt. Some laundresses would add other substances to improve their cleaning. Urine, particularly stale urine, was surprisingly common. The ammonia in urine is effective at breaking down certain stains and was especially valued for cleaning wool. Yes, medieval people deliberately used old urine for laundry. Chamber pots were emptied, and the contents were sometimes saved for this purpose. Fuller's earth, a type of clay, was another option. It absorbed oils and dirt and was particularly useful for wool and delicate fabrics, but it had to be sourced and purchased, which added to the cost. For particularly stubborn stains, laundresses might use a combination of treatments. Bloodstains, for instance, were notoriously difficult. They had to be treated with cold water first, because hot water would set the stain. Then you might apply salt or crushed radish, let it sit, and scrub vigorously. Wine stains required immediate attention and could sometimes be removed with white wine or vinegar, which must have seemed wasteful to use expensive wine to remove wine stains. But there you go. The tools for applying these cleaning agents were basic. A brush made from stiff bristles, perhaps from a pig. A wooden paddle for stirring the laundry in the hot water. A wooden board, often ridged, for scrubbing. And your hands, mostly your hands. The lye and soap would make your hands dry, cracked, and painful. Laundresses often had hands that were red, raw, and covered in small wounds that never quite healed because they were constantly being exposed to harsh chemicals. There were no rubber gloves, no hand lotion, just the daily reality of working with substances that slowly destroyed your skin. And all of this preparation, this gathering of ash and making of lye and heating of water, had to happen before the actual washing could begin. Finally, we arrive at the actual washing, and this is where the real work began. The heavily soiled items went into the hot water first. These might include kitchen cloths stained with food, undergarments, or any linens that had been used in ways we won't elaborate on. The laundress would submerge these items in the cauldron of hot, lye-treated water and let them soak for a period of time. Perhaps half an hour. Perhaps longer if the stains were particularly stubborn. While they soaked, she might agitate them with her paddle, stirring them around to ensure the cleaning solution penetrated the fabric. The heat and the lye would start to break down the dirt and oils. The water would gradually turn grey, then brownish, then nearly black, depending on how soiled the items were. After soaking, each item had to be removed from the hot water. This required care, because boiling water and scalded hands don't mix well. The laundress would use her paddle to fish out an item, let it cool slightly, and then begin the scrubbing process. The scrubbing happened on a washboard or washing stone. In rural areas, this might literally be a smooth stone by the riverbank. In town settings, it could be a purpose-built wooden board with ridges. The laundress would lay the wet garment on this surface and scrub, using a brush or her hands, working the fabric to loosen the remaining dirt. This scrubbing motion was repetitive and required significant force. You weren't gently patting at the fabric. You were grinding it against the board, using friction and pressure to force the dirt out. This was hard on the fabric, which is why medieval clothing, particularly everyday items, showed wear relatively quickly. The washing process itself was abrasive. For particularly dirty spots, you might apply more soap or lye directly to the area and scrub harder. Collar areas, underarms, anywhere that had regular contact with skin, these all required extra attention. And here's where the physical toll really shows. Imagine doing this for hours. Your back is bent over the washboard. Your arms are moving in a constant scrubbing motion. Your hands are wet and wrinkled and painful from the lye. The steam from the hot water is making you sweat, even in winter, and you're only partway through one load of laundry. After the scrubbing came the rinsing. Oh, the rinsing. This required clean water, and lots of it. You'd immerse the scrubbed item in fresh water, agitate it to remove the soap and lye, squeeze it out, and repeat. Then repeat again. And possibly a third time, because any lye left in the fabric would irritate the skin of whoever wore the garment later. If you were working at a river, you could use the current to help with rinsing. You'd hold the garment in the flowing water, letting it carry away the soap. If you were working with buckets and tubs, you'd go through multiple rinses, changing the water each time. More trips to the well, more carrying of heavy buckets, more waiting for the water to drain. After rinsing came wringing. Medieval laundresses didn't have spin cycles or even mechanical wringers. They had their hands and their strength. They'd twist the wet fabric, squeezing out as much water as possible. This was easier said than done, especially with heavy items like blankets or large sheets. Sometimes two people would work together, each twisting from opposite ends. The goal was to remove enough water that the item wouldn't take forever to dry, but wet wool or linen is heavy and doesn't give up its water easily. All of this soaking, scrubbing, rinsing, and wringing, had to be done for every single item. A full day's work might include a dozen shifts, several pairs of hose, multiple tablecloths, and various household linens, each one going through the same process, one at a time, for hours. Not all laundry could be thrown into a cauldron of boiling lye water. Some items required more careful treatment, and these items often caused laundresses the most anxiety because they were expensive and easily damaged. Fine linens belonging to wealthy households fell into this category. These might include shirts made from imported linen, delicate veils, or elaborately embroidered items. Such things couldn't withstand harsh scrubbing and strong lye. They needed gentler soap and a lighter touch. The laundress would use lukewarm water rather than boiling hot. She'd make a milder soap solution, testing it carefully to ensure it wasn't too harsh. The washing would be done by hand, gently squeezing and pressing the fabric rather than scrubbing it against a board. This took even longer than regular washing because you couldn't use force. You had to rely on the soap and time to do the work. Coloured fabrics presented their own challenges. Many medieval dyes were not particularly stable. Wash a red tunic too vigorously, and you might end up with a pink tunic. Blue could fade to a washed-out grey. Green was notorious for running. So the laundress had to be careful, using cooler water and briefer washing times. Some wealthy clients wanted their whites to be exceptionally white. This required a process called bleaching. In areas with strong sunshine, the laundress might lay the damp white linens on grass or bushes in direct sunday. The combination of moisture, sunlight, and the oxygen released by the grass would gradually bleach the fabric brighter. This could take several days, and the linens had to be dampened repeatedly and watched carefully to ensure they didn't blow away or get stolen. In northern areas where sunshine was less reliable, alternatives were used. Sulfur fumigation could whiten fabrics, though it left an unpleasant smell. Some laundresses used buttermilk soaks. Others relied on repeated washing with strong soap and plenty of rinsing. Each method had its adherents and its drawbacks. Wool was particularly difficult. It couldn't be washed in hot water because hot water causes wool to shrink and felt. So wool items had to be washed in cool or lukewarm water, using soap rather than lye, and handled with care. They couldn't be wrung out forcefully or they'd lose their shape. They had to be pressed gently between cloths to remove excess water and then dried flat. This made washing wool a specialized skill, and some laundresses charged extra for it. And then there were furs. Yes, medieval people sometimes wanted their fur-trimmed garments cleaned. This was a nightmare. Fur doesn't react well to water. It becomes matted and smelly. The best approach was to brush the fur vigorously and use dry methods, such as rubbing with sawdust or bran to absorb oils and dirt. But this wasn't always effective, and many furs simply weren't cleaned at all. They were aired out and hoped for the best. All of these special cases meant that a laundress needed to be knowledgeable. She had to recognize different fabrics and dyes. She had to understand what treatments would work and which ones would cause damage. And she had to hope that her client wouldn't blame her if something went wrong, because sometimes fabrics are just fragile, and even the most careful washing can cause problems. Once everything was finally washed, rinsed, and wrung out, it had to dry. And in medieval times, drying laundry was yet another challenge that required planning and patience. The simplest method was to lay items outside on grass, bushes, or over fences and hedges. This worked well in warm, dry weather. The combination of sun and breeze would dry most items within a few hours. But of course, the weather didn't always cooperate. In rainy or cold weather, drying became problematic. Indoor drying was possible but slow. Items would be hung over chairs, draped across tables, or suspended from ropes or poles strung across a room. The heat from the hearth would gradually dry them, but this could take a full day or longer, especially for thick items like blankets. Medieval laundresses working for wealthy households might have access to drying rooms or lofts. These were spaces, sometimes heated, where laundry could be hung. But most laundresses working independently had to make do with whatever space they could find. Frost was a particular enemy of the drying process. In winter, wet laundry hung outside could freeze solid. Some people believed that freezing actually helped clean the fabric, and there might have been some truth to this. The expanding ice crystals could force out remaining dirt. But frozen laundry is stiff and uncomfortable to handle, and it still needs to thaw and dry afterward, which extends the process considerably. Wind could be helpful or harmful. A gentle breeze would speed drying. A strong wind could blow items away entirely. Laundresses had to weigh down lighter items with stones or use wooden pegs, which were early versions of clothespins, carved from wood and split to grip the fabric. Theft was also a concern. Laundry left unattended outside could disappear. Clothing had value, especially clean clothing. So the laundress or someone in the household had to keep an eye on the drying laundry, at least periodically. This was yet another task in an already long list of tasks. Once the items were dry, they had to be collected, folded, and returned to the client. Some laundresses offered pressing or smoothing services for an additional fee. This involved heating a heavy iron, typically a solid chunk of metal with a handle, in the fire and then pressing it over the fabric to remove wrinkles. This had to be done carefully, as too hot an iron would scorch the fabric, not hot enough, and it wouldn't remove the wrinkles. The entire process, from collecting the dirty laundry to returning it clean and dry, could take anywhere from 1 to several days, depending on the weather, the amount of laundry, and how many clients the laundress was serving. And then, of course, it was time to start the next load. We should talk about what this work did to the women who performed it. Because being a laundress wasn't just difficult, it was actively damaging to your health. The most obvious issue was the hands. Constant exposure to lye, harsh soap and water destroyed the skin. Laundresses developed chronically dry, cracked hands that split and bled. These wounds could become infected, especially given the lack of antibiotics and the constant re-exposure to dirty water. Some laundresses wrapped their hands in rags when they weren't working, applying animal fat to try to soothe the skin, but it rarely helped much. The back pain was constant. Hours spent bent over washboards or cauldrons led to chronic back problems. Many laundresses developed a permanent stoop by middle age. There was no physical therapy, no chiropractors, no pain medication beyond perhaps some willow bark tea if you could afford it. The knees suffered too, particularly for laundresses who worked at rivers. Kneeling on stones, often in cold water, day after day, led to joint problems. Some women developed what we might now recognize as arthritis, though they simply knew it as pain that made it hard to work and harder to sleep. Respiratory issues were common. The constant exposure to steam, the smoke from fires used to heat water, and the fumes from lye all took their toll on the lungs. Laundresses often developed chronic coughs. In an era when tuberculosis and other respiratory diseases were prevalent, this was particularly concerning. And then there was the sheer exhaustion. The physical demands of the work were relentless. Lifting, carrying, scrubbing, wringing. All of it required strength and stamina. A young woman might manage well enough, but as she aged, the work became harder. And there was no retirement. You worked until you couldn't anymore, and then you hoped someone would take care of you. Pregnancy and childbirth added another layer of difficulty. Laundresses who became pregnant had to continue working as long as possible because they needed the income. The heavy lifting and constant bending weren't ideal for a pregnant woman, but there was no maternity leave, no accommodation. You worked until the baby came, took a brief rest if you could afford it, and then went back to work. Some laundresses tried to pace themselves, spreading the work over several days instead of rushing to finish. But this wasn't always possible. Clients wanted their laundry returned quickly. If you took too long, they'd find someone else. So you pushed yourself, even when your body was screaming at you to stop. The life expectancy for working-class medieval women was already lower than for wealthier women. The physical demands of being a laundress likely made it even lower. There are no statistics available, no records kept of how long laundresses lived or what they died from. But it's not hard to imagine that the work took years off their lives. Being a laundress wasn't just physically demanding. It came with social implications that affected how these women were viewed in their communities. Laundresses occupied an odd position in medieval society. On one hand, they provided an essential service. Even wealthy households that employed servants for other tasks often hired outside laundresses for major washing jobs. On the other hand, the work itself was considered lowly. It was dirty, hard, and associated with the messiest aspects of daily life. There was also a moral dimension to how laundresses were perceived. Women who worked with their hands, particularly in jobs that involved handling others' intimate items like underclothes and bed linens, were sometimes viewed with suspicion. In some medieval communities, laundresses had reputations, deserved or not, for being of loose morals. This reputation had practical consequences. A laundress needed to guard her reputation carefully if she wanted to maintain steady work with respectable clients. She had to be trustworthy, because she was handling valuable items. She had to be discreet, because she might see stains or damage to clothing that revealed private information about clients' lives. And she had to conduct herself properly, lest rumors damage her business. Some laundresses worked primarily for churches, monasteries, or convents. This was considered slightly more respectable than working for private households, though it wasn't necessarily easier work. Religious institutions had specific requirements for cleanliness, and their linens, especially altar cloths, had to be handled with particular care. But at least there was a certain dignity to saying you washed for the church. Laundresses, who worked in towns and cities, sometimes formed informal networks. They might share information about good clients and bad ones, warn each other about people who didn't pay, or help each other out during particularly busy periods. These networks provided some measure of mutual support in what was otherwise a fairly isolated profession. The relationship between laundress and client could be complex. Wealthy clients often looked down on their laundresses but depended on them. They'd complain about the cost, criticize the work, and sometimes delay payment. But they also needed the service, which gave the laundress a small amount of leverage, though not much. Payment was often a source of tension. Some clients paid in coin, which was straightforward. Others paid in kind, providing food, old clothing, or other goods. This wasn't necessarily bad, but it did mean the laundress had less control over what she received. And some clients simply didn't pay, or paid late, or argued about the amount owed. A laundress had limited recourse. She could refuse future work, but if she needed the income, that wasn't always an option. There were occasional stories of laundresses who managed to improve their circumstances. Perhaps they saved enough to rent a better workspace, or to hire an assistant. Maybe they married someone with a trade and could reduce their laundry work. But these were the exceptions. Most laundresses remained laundresses for their entire working lives. doing the same exhausting work year after year because it was what they knew and what they could do. The work of a laundress wasn't the same throughout the year. The seasons brought different challenges and different patterns of work. Spring was generally considered the best time for laundry. The weather was warming up, which made working with water more bearable. Rivers were flowing well, providing plenty of water. There was enough sun to dry laundry, but not so much heat that the work became oppressively hot. Spring was when wealthy households often did their major washing, cleaning the heavy linens and woolens that had been used all winter. This meant spring was busy for laundresses. They might have more work than they could easily handle. Some would take on extra helpers, often young women or girls learning the trade. The increased income was welcome, but the increased workload was exhausting. Summer brought its own issues. The heat made standing over cauldrons of boiling water nearly unbearable. Laundresses would be drenched in sweat, overheated, and at risk of fainting. But the weather was generally good for drying, which was an advantage. Some laundresses tried to do the hottest parts of the work early in the morning before the day heated up, though this meant rising even earlier than usual. In summer, rivers could sometimes run low, especially during dry spells. This made it harder to rinse laundry effectively. Wells might need to be dug deeper, and in some areas, water had to be rationed or purchased at higher prices. All of this added to the challenges. Autumn was transitional. The weather was cooling, which made the physical work more comfortable, but it also meant less reliable drying weather. Laundresses had to plan more carefully, washing on days when the forecast, such as it was, suggested Sunday rain could delay work for days. And then came winter. Winter was the most difficult season for laundry work. The cold was punishing. Water froze in buckets, rivers iced over or became too cold to work in. Wells could freeze solid. Even when water was available, working with it meant numb fingers and aching hands. The drying process in winter was particularly problematic. Items hung outside would freeze before they dried. Indoor drying took forever, especially in homes with minimal heating. Some wealthy households simply reduced their laundry during winter, making do with less frequent washing and more frequent airing and brushing of garments. For laundresses, winter often meant reduced income. There was less work available, and what work there was took longer and was more miserable. Some laundresses tried to supplement their income with other work, perhaps spinning or brewing, though these weren't always options. The winter was when the health toll of the work became most apparent. Hands that were already damaged from lye would crack even worse in the cold. Respiratory problems worsened with the cold air, and the increased time spent near fires, and the general discomfort of being cold and wet for hours at a time was hard to overstate. Despite all of this, laundry still needed to be done. Underclothes still got dirty. Kitchen cloths still needed washing. So the laundress would wrap herself in whatever warm clothing she could find, build up her fire to heat water, and carry on. Because there wasn't really any other choice. The tools of a medieval laundress were simple, but each one served a specific purpose, and a skilled laundress knew how to use them effectively. The most essential tool was the cauldron or large pot. This needed to be big enough to hold a significant amount of water and sturdy enough to withstand repeated heating. Iron cauldrons were ideal but expensive. Many laundresses made do with cheaper pots made from copper or bronze, or even large ceramic vessels. These had to be treated carefully, as they could crack if heated unevenly. The cauldron was typically suspended over a fire on a tripod or set into a purpose-built fireplace. Managing the fire was a skill in itself. Too hot, and you'd boil the water away. Not hot enough, and the washing wouldn't be effective. The laundress had to tend the fire constantly, adding wood or adjusting the coals. The washing board or stone was another essential. This could be as simple as a flat stone with a naturally rough surface, or as elaborate as a wooden board with purpose-made ridges. The quality of the washing board affected the quality of the scrubbing. A good board would remove dirt without damaging the fabric too much. A poor board would be either ineffective or too abrasive. Paddles and stirring sticks were used to agitate laundry in hot water and to fish items out without burning your hands. These were typically carved from hardwood and needed to be long enough to reach the bottom of the cauldron safely. Brushes were made from natural bristles, often from pigs or sometimes from horsehair. These were used for scrubbing particularly dirty spots. The bristles wore down over time and had to be replaced periodically. Buckets and tubs were needed for carrying water, for rinsing, and for soaking items. A laundress might have several of these in various sizes. They were made from wood, Bound with metal hoops to prevent leaking, these required maintenance. The wood could dry out and shrink, creating gaps. The metal hoops could rust. A leaky bucket was useless, so repairs were ongoing. Drying racks or lines were necessary for hanging laundry. In some cases, these were as simple as a rope strung between two posts. In more elaborate setups, wooden frames could be constructed, allowing multiple items to be hung in a small space. Some laundresses used hedges or bushes for drying, which was free but less reliable. The workspace itself varied greatly. Some laundresses worked from their own homes, if they had space. This might mean a small courtyard or a room designated for washing. Others rented space, perhaps sharing a washing area with other laundresses, and some worked primarily outdoors, at riversides or communal washing areas. A good workspace needed access to water, space to set up cauldrons and fires, room to scrub and wring laundry, and somewhere to dry items. It also needed to be secure, as tools and clothing could be stolen if left unattended. Not every laundress had access to ideal conditions. Many made do with cramped, poorly lit spaces that made the work even harder than it already was. Some towns had communal washing facilities. These were areas set aside specifically for laundry work, often near a river or a public well. Multiple laundresses would work in these spaces, each managing their own fires and washing areas but sharing the general location. This could create a sense of community, but it could also lead to competition and disputes over space and resources. The tools and workspace weren't free. If you wanted to set yourself up as a laundress, you needed to acquire these things first. For women with limited means, this could be a significant barrier. Some inherited tools from family members in the trade. Others pieced together equipment gradually, buying or bartering for items as they could afford them. And some simply made do with the minimum, which made their work harder but was better than not being able to work at all. Let's talk about money. Because ultimately, laundry was work, and work needed to pay enough to survive. As mentioned earlier, a typical laundress in medieval England might earn about 2 pence per day. But this wasn't a daily wage in the sense of guaranteed income. This was what you could earn if you had work, if you worked a full day, and if your client actually paid you. The reality was more complicated. Payment was often by the piece rather than by time. You might be paid a certain amount per shirt, per sheet, per tablecloth. Larger or heavily soiled items would command higher prices. Delicate items that required special care might also cost more. A simple linen shirt might cost a halfpenny to wash. A large tablecloth might be 2 pence. A wool blanket, with all the extra care required, might be 3 or 4 pence. These prices varied by region and time period, but they give a general sense of the economics. Now, let's think about what a laundress could actually accomplish in a day. Washing, rinsing, and wringing a dozen shirts might take the better part of a day, especially if they were dirty. That's 6 pence of income, theoretically. But you also had costs. The wood or charcoal for your fire cost money. The soap or materials to make lye had to be paid for. If you had to pay for water, that was another expense. If you rented workspace, there was rent. After accounting for these costs, a laundress might actually take home 3 or 4 pence from a full day's work. This was enough to buy food for herself and perhaps 1 or 2 dependents, but not much beyond that. There was no surplus for saving, no cushion for emergencies, and work wasn't always steady. Wealthy clients might send laundry once a week, or every 2 weeks, or monthly. It depended on their needs and their habits. During winter, work might slow down. During busy seasons like spring, you might be overwhelmed. This irregularity made it hard to plan or budget. Some laundresses tried to establish regular arrangements with specific households. You'd agree to come on certain days and handle all their laundry for a flat monthly rate. This provided more predictable income but also locked you into a specific schedule and workload. If the household produced more laundry than expected, you still had to handle it for the agreed price. Larger households, particularly noble estates, might employ a laundress full-time. This was relatively rare but did happen. Such positions offered more security and sometimes included room and board as part of the compensation. But they also meant you were at the beck and call of the household and had less freedom. For most laundresses, the goal was simply to earn enough to survive. There wasn't room for ambition or dreams of advancement. You worked, you earned, you paid for food and shelter, and you started again the next day. If you got sick and couldn't work, there was no income. If you got old and couldn't work, there was no pension. You relied on family if you had them, or on charity from the church or community. The economics were particularly harsh for laundresses who were supporting families. A widow with children had to earn enough not just for herself but for her dependents. Children could help with simpler tasks, fetching water or stirring the cauldron, but they couldn't do the skilled work of scrubbing and wringing. So the widow had to work longer hours or take on more clients, or somehow stretch her income further than seemed possible. There were no loans available for working-class women. No credit. If you needed something, you either had the money to pay for it, or you did without. This meant that any setback, an injury, a tool breaking, a client refusing to pay, could be catastrophic. You had no cushion, no reserves. You were always one or two bad breaks away from real hardship. The experience of being a laundress varied depending on who you were working for. Different types of households had different needs and different expectations. In peasant households, laundry was typically done by the women of the family rather than hired out. They owned few garments, maybe 2 or 3 sets of clothing per person, and washing was an occasional task rather than a weekly routine. The methods were simple: cold water from a river or well, basic soap if any, scrubbing on stones. These families couldn't afford to hire a laundress, so they did the work themselves despite also managing farms, children, and all other household duties. Middle-class households in towns, merchants and craftspeople, were where many laundresses found work. These families had more clothing and linens than peasants, enough to make hiring someone worthwhile but not so much that it required a full-time employee. A laundress might come once a week or every 2 weeks, spending a full day washing the accumulated laundry. These clients expected good work and clean results, but they weren't necessarily demanding about methods or timing. Wealthy households presented both opportunities and challenges. They had large amounts of laundry, the family's clothing, servants' clothing, bed linens, table linens, kitchen cloths, towels. They could afford to hire laundresses regularly and pay reasonable rates, but they also had high expectations. The laundry needed to be spotlessly clean, perfectly white where appropriate, and returned promptly. Any damage or staining could result in harsh criticism or refusal to pay. Religious houses, monasteries, and convents had their own particular requirements. They valued cleanliness highly, as it was associated with godliness. Altar cloths had to be immaculate. The monks' or nuns' habits had to be clean and well maintained. These institutions often employed laundresses regularly, sometimes providing them with workspace on the monastery grounds. The pay was usually reliable, and there was a certain respect afforded to those who worked for the church. But the standards were exacting, and there was no room for mistakes. Noble estates were the most demanding clients. They had vast amounts of laundry and expected it to be handled with expertise. Fine linens, elaborate garments, tablecloths for feasts, hangings and decorative textiles, all of these required careful handling. A laundress working for a noble household might be one of several, each specializing in different types of items. There might be one laundress for ordinary linens, another for fine garments, and yet another for household textiles. The pay at noble estates was better, but so was the scrutiny. Any damage could result in severe consequences. The laundress might be required to pay for ruined items, which could be worth more than she'd earn in months. The pressure to perform perfectly was constant. Royal households were in a category of their own. The volume of laundry was immense, the variety was staggering, and the standards were impossible. Laundresses who worked for royalty were typically highly experienced and came with strong recommendations. They were well compensated, relatively speaking, but they also worked long hours under intense pressure. The slightest error could end their career. Most laundresses worked for a mix of clients, moving between different households as needed. You might wash for a merchant family on Monday, a priest on Tuesday, and a craftsman's widow on Wednesday. This variety provided income, but also meant constantly adapting to different expectations and different types of laundry. Beyond the regular routine of washing everyday clothing and linens, laundresses sometimes faced special situations that presented unique challenges. Weddings were one such occasion. A wealthy family preparing for a wedding would want everything spotless. This meant washing all the best linens, tablecloths, napkins, and any decorative textiles that would be displayed. The bride's clothing and the family's finest garments all needed to be cleaned in preparation. This created a surge of work for laundresses, who might be hired specifically for the occasion. The pay was good, but the pressure was intense, and the work had to be completed on a tight schedule. Funerals also required laundry services. The deceased had to be dressed in clean clothing. The household would want fresh linens, and afterward, there would be additional washing to do. In an era when many deaths were from illnesses, handling the laundry of sick or deceased individuals carried risk. Diseases weren't well understood, but people knew that illness could spread. Laundresses charged extra for this work, and some refused it entirely. Plague outbreaks created particular problems. During times of epidemic disease, laundry from infected households was considered dangerous. Some laundresses refused such work entirely. Others agreed but demanded much higher pay. The items would be handled with extreme care, often burned afterward rather than cleaned. The fear of contagion was real and well-founded. Seasonal festivals sometimes meant extra work. Before Christmas or Easter, households would often do major cleanings, including washing all their textiles. This was similar to spring cleaning, a tradition that dates back centuries. For laundresses, this meant busy periods with multiple clients, all wanting work done at the same time. Traveling nobles or royalty could create sudden demands. If a noble party was visiting an area, local households might need to prepare guest accommodations on short notice. This included cleaning all the linens and hangings in guest rooms. Laundresses could be called upon to work quickly, often through the night, to have everything ready. Accidents and spills created unscheduled work. A servant dropping a tray of wine at a feast, a child's accident, an incident in the kitchen. Any of these could mean immediate laundry needs. Clients expected their laundresses to be available for such emergencies, though they didn't always want to pay extra for the inconvenience. Seasonal items required special attention. Winter cloaks and heavy blankets needed thorough cleaning before being stored for summer. Summer linens needed washing before being packed away for winter. Getting these items properly clean and dry before storage was important, as damp or dirty textiles could develop mold or attract vermin. Vermin infestations, speaking of which, were a recurring challenge. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were common in medieval households. Washing could help control these pests, but it wasn't always effective. Some laundresses used additional treatments, fumigating items with smoke or treating them with herbs that were thought to repel insects. The effectiveness of these methods varied. Stains from various substances required different approaches. Ink stains, for instance, were notoriously difficult and required immediate treatment with substances like sour milk or ox gall. Oil or grease stains needed to be treated with fuller's earth or chalk. Rust stains from metal fastenings could sometimes be removed with lemon juice or vinegar, if you could afford such things. A skilled laundress knew dozens of these remedies and when to apply them. Sometimes clients would bring items that were beyond saving, textiles that were rotting, falling apart, or so heavily stained that no amount of washing would help. A good laundress learned to assess items honestly and tell clients when something couldn't be cleaned. This wasn't always welcome news, but it was better than attempting the impossible and being blamed for failure. The skills of a laundress weren't learned from books. There were no laundry schools in the medieval period. The knowledge was passed down through apprenticeship, observation, and family tradition. Most laundresses learned the trade from their mothers or other female relatives. A girl might start helping with laundry as young as 7 or 8, performing simple tasks like fetching water or stirring the cauldron. As she grew older and stronger, she'd graduate to more complex tasks, learning to scrub, wring, and judge when items were clean. This informal apprenticeship could last years. It took time to learn all the tricks of the trade, how to judge the strength of lye by feel, which stains needed, which treatments, how to handle delicate fabrics without damaging them, when to use hot water and when to use cold. Much of this knowledge was acquired through experience, through trial and error, through ruining a few items and learning not to make the same mistakes again. The relationship between an experienced laundress and her apprentice, whether daughter, niece, or hired help, was complex. The older woman had valuable knowledge, but she also had competition. Teaching someone the trade thoroughly meant potentially creating a rival who might take clients. But not teaching meant the knowledge could be lost, and there was also the practical consideration that an extra pair of skilled hands made the work easier. Some aspects of the work were closely guarded secrets. A laundress who had developed a particularly effective stain removal method, or who knew how to achieve exceptionally white linens, might keep those techniques to herself. These were competitive advantages that could mean the difference between being sought after and being just another option. In larger towns, There might be informal networks of laundresses who shared information. They'd exchange tips about reliable suppliers of soap or ash, warn each other about clients who didn't pay, or recommend each other for jobs they couldn't take themselves. This created a loose community of practice, though it was never formalized into guilds or organizations the way many male trades were. The lack of formal training or recognition was part of what kept laundry work low status. It was seen as something any woman could do, even though skilled laundresses knew this wasn't true. There was real expertise involved, real knowledge that took years to acquire. But because it was women's work and wasn't formalized, it wasn't valued in the same way as trades like carpentry or smithing. Language was another way knowledge was passed. Each region had its own terminology for different types of stains, fabrics, or cleaning methods. A laundress working in one area might not immediately understand all the terms used by laundresses in another region. These linguistic differences reinforced the local nature of the trade and the importance of learning from those around you. Some knowledge came from surprising sources. Laundresses would sometimes learn techniques from each other at rivers or communal washing areas. Watching another woman handle a difficult stain or seeing how she wrung out heavy items could provide new ideas. This collective learning, women working alongside each other and sharing information, was valuable even when it wasn't acknowledged as such. Written records of laundry techniques from the medieval period are scarce. Most laundresses couldn't read or write. The knowledge existed in memory and in practice, demonstrated and observed rather than recorded. This means much of what medieval laundresses knew has been lost. We can reconstruct some of it from later sources and from the evidence of surviving textiles, but the full depth of their expertise is gone. What we do know suggests that medieval laundresses were more skilled than they're often given credit for. They understood chemistry, even if they didn't call it that. They knew that different substances reacted with fabrics in different ways. They understood heat and its effects. They had developed techniques for problems that would challenge even modern laundry practitioners. Their knowledge was practical, empirical, and effective. So, what can we take away from all of this? What does the life of a medieval laundress tell us? First, it reminds us that behind every aspect of medieval life that we think of as normal, clean clothing, fresh linens, presentable appearance, there was enormous labor. Labor that was mostly invisible, performed by people whose names we don't know, and whose work was taken for granted. The laundress represents a whole class of workers who made medieval society function but who were rarely acknowledged. They weren't heroic. They didn't fight battles or build cathedrals or write important documents. They washed clothes. Day after day, year after year, they washed clothes, and society depended on them. Second, it illustrates the physical cost of life before modern conveniences. We turn on a washing machine and walk away. We complain if the cycle takes more than an hour. Medieval laundresses spent entire days, multiple days, doing what our machines do in minutes. And they did it with their bodies, their hands, their backs, their strength. The work wore them down, damaged them, shortened their lives. This was the price of clean clothes. Third, it shows us the economics of survival in the medieval period. A laundress worked incredibly hard and earned barely enough to live. There was no prospect of getting ahead, no chance of real prosperity. The best you could hope for was to keep working, keep earning, keep surviving. And if anything went wrong, if you got sick or injured or simply got too old, there was no safety net. You relied on family or charity, or you suffered. The life of a medieval laundress was not romanticized. There's no fairy tale version of this story. It was simply hard work, inadequately compensated, socially undervalued, and physically destructive. These women didn't choose this work because they loved it, or because they had a calling. They did it because they needed to survive, and this was what was available to them. And yet, there's something to be said for the skill they developed, the knowledge they accumulated, the way they made the best of difficult circumstances. They found ways to make the work manageable, developed techniques that worked, created informal networks of support. They took pride in doing the work well, even when that work was grueling. When we think of the medieval period, we often think of knights and castles, of grand cathedrals and elaborate ceremonies. But the reality of medieval life for most people was much more mundane. It was getting up before dawn to haul water. It was spending the day bent over a washboard, hands raw from lye. It was wringing out heavy linens until your arms ached. It was hanging laundry in the cold wind, hoping it would dry before dark. The laundresses who did this work are mostly forgotten now. Their names didn't appear in chronicles or church records, unless they happened to be involved in some unusual event. They didn't leave personal writings or detailed accounts of their lives. What we know of them comes from indirect sources, account books that list laundry expenses, court records of disputes over payment, occasional references in larger narratives about medieval life. But they were there. In every medieval town and village, in every household that valued cleanliness, there were women doing this work. Heating water, scrubbing fabric, rinsing, wringing, drying. The same tasks, repeated endlessly, making possible the clean appearance that society expected. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your clean sheets, maybe spare a thought for the medieval laundress. For the woman who spent her day in cold water and harsh soap, who scrubbed until her hands bled, who wrung heavy linens until her arms screamed, all so that someone else could enjoy the luxury of clean linen. Her work was hard, her life was difficult, and her story is worth remembering. The endless battle against dirt, the daily struggle to make things clean, the physical toll of work that never truly ends because clothes keep getting dirty, and laundry always needs to be done. This was the reality of a medieval laundress. Not glamorous, not exciting, just necessary. And that necessity employed countless women across centuries. Women who worked until they couldn't anymore, and then faded from history, leaving behind only the faint traces of their labor in account books and records. It's a humbling thought, and perhaps in its own way, a peaceful one. Because there's something almost meditative about understanding work that was this simple and this difficult. Wash, rinse, wring, dry, repeat, day after day, year after year, century after century. The rhythm of it, the inevitability of it, the way it just continued regardless of wars or plagues or changes in government. Laundry is eternal. Someone has to do it. In the medieval period, that someone was usually a woman standing at a river or bent over a cauldron, doing work that destroyed her body but kept society clean. Her reward was barely enough to survive, but she did the work anyway because someone had to, and she was that someone. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. The story of work that was hard, necessary, and almost never appreciated. The story of women whose names we don't know but whose labor made medieval life possible. The endless, repetitive, exhausting work of keeping things clean. Rest well, everyone, and maybe appreciate your washing machine a little more in the morning.